Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Fusion Strike, make sure you go ahead and check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your order using that code Omnipoke. For today's video, myself and Jack are going to be doing an updated tier list for December. It's been over a month now of the format being out, so we've figured it's worth updating since our last tier list, which was just a predictor really. Before the set even was out, myself and Jack were just getting some games in on tabletop and trying to theory out the best lists. So this is where we initially started off. We of course want to always touch on some of the newer archetypes and sort of give them a rating just to see where we thought they had a chance if the meta went in certain directions, as well as some of the headlining cards from the set. And I think overall we did like a decent job, Jack.
Yeah, I think so. There's obviously going to be with a much wider array of people playing the decks and a much wider array of data to look at. There was obviously going to be some kind of differences, but I think we did pretty well. There will be some decks as we switch over to today's tier list. You'll see some decks that we perhaps don't feature that were on the initial one. But like Joe said, we wanted to pick up every single kind of new archetype going into Fusion Strike, even if we thought they weren't going to be too competitive. Then this one is a lot more results based. So we're looking at decks that have actually been performing well. So, for example, things like Boltund and Serena really haven't seen much play. So even though they're on our first tier list, they're actually not going to be on this next one.
Yeah, so let's jump into the new December tier list. And as you said, more results-based, but still with a good amount of our opinion in there. And I think we'll just tackle Mew VMAX first. I think it's the most obvious tier S deck. I think basically from week one, it's been winning and taking down tournaments, consistently cutting way more than every other archetype. Even with some great dark type decks in the format, it's still managing to maintain like at least a 40% win rate into most of those. I think it's like pure Gengar and like maybe Eternatus that push into that like sub 40% win rate range, but even then it's still like not by any means like a loss because you just have that incredible tempo at your disposal. I think as the formats come on, especially in reaction to dark decks almost, the Meloetta aggro build has become the preference just so that you can have like that turn 2 smack option to at least be like swinging, even if it's taking like a one prize with like a Mew or just the Meloetta itself, and just throwing a one prize into the active can just skew that race that little bit better. So I think with so many people targeting Mew, it makes sense that Meloetta and like Cramomatic combo builds are kind of rising to the top right now. But I still personally like one or two Peony in the list just to have that extra safety net every now and then. And I'm still an advocate of cross switcher, so I'm kind of in a mash approach right now where I'm playing a little bit of Peony, still having some cross switches, but then also like a ton of the Rotom phones and all the speed cards. So yeah, Mew still top dog pretty much. Not much else to really say there. It draws too many cards. It has access to a ton of good stuff. Flexible, and even some one prize decks can struggle because you have like built-in can jump back into the deck if you're not one shot. So it still just has like a ton of things here going for it, I think.
Yeah, everyone kind of knew that it was going to be the case, and I think it was this weekend's or this week's most recent statistics, Mew took up like 35% of the top eights or something, which was it's absolutely crazy. It's like I'm pretty sure on at least one of the tier lists I saw, I think it was Justin Basil's. It was like tier 0, and then nothing even came close to tier 1. The next decks were like tier 2 in terms of representation.
Yeah.
So yeah, Mew is just hyper popular right now. So yeah, kind of as most people predicted. But yeah, pretty solid on that one. Into tier 1, and we won't necessarily be going down the tiers in the order, but I did want to pick up first things first with Jolteon Inteleon. Jolteon has kind of maintained a pretty solid status into this format, still being able to deal with a lot of the other Inteleon decks and stuff by applying a lot of pressure to the bench. That was kind of always its forte back in the Evolving Skies meta, and it still has that right now. I think Mew can sometimes be a bit awkward, but obviously they have like path. Their win condition seems to be sort of path kind of plays. With Inteleon builds, you can run things like these fans and stuff that can also disrupt Mew players. So there are outs in that matchup. But yeah, basically any matchup that starts to build their bench, there's still a lot of Inteleon decks around. There's still even sort of single strike decks that are less fighting focused now, which means that there are instances of single strike decks that feel more popular or you're more comfortable with now as well. There's still a lot of bench sitters, a lot of these setup Pokemon, and that's the kind of format Jolteon loves to be in. So there are awkward things with Mew here and there. But I think Jolteon is still in a very, very good spot because basically the rest of the meta is still kind of a pretty big feasting ground for it, other than like the old school single strike builds and some of the new, more popular rapid strike builds. They're basically the only kind of matchups you really want to avoid. Everything else, Jolteon applies so much pressure. 100-100 is still very, very strong, especially when you're able to do it for 1 energy in some instances, but even 2 energy, it's still a lot of pressure. And yeah, the Inteleon engine is still really, really strong as well. So it's kind of a deck that has maybe gained a few more awkward matchups here and there, especially at the top of at the top of the tier list. But in general, its game plan hasn't really changed that much, and it's still a very, very solid game plan. Just applying pressure to people's engines, forcing them to have to make weird plays, protect awkward Pokemon here and there. And if it's going well, you're also disrupting them at the same time. So yeah, Jolteon's still a really, really popular and deserving tier 1 archetype, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Like you said, the Urshis are scary, and Mew isn't the best. There's the cross your fingers approach. My latest tech is actually a Vikavolt in the list. Is something that I'm trying because I'm split stadiums right now with the Stormies as well as Paths. And if you can go first in that matchup and get an energy on Vikavolt, you can then like gust up Genesect for a little while and just prod to put your like Jolteon into range of like multiple prize turns. While you build your intels as well. So that's something I'm experimenting with to maybe help that Mew match up that little bit. Let's talk about another deck that's sort of in the limelight recently and has been getting some decent results, surprisingly. And that's actually Duraludon. Duraludon, we're saying, is a tier 2 archetype. It has, it's still rogue and its draw engine is still kind of sus. But that ability, as we know, is just awkward for a ton of archetypes. This is really benefiting from the way that Mew has adapted in these recent weeks, where it's gone so streamlined that it's down to like 6 energy cards, and you can literally just Crushing Hammer and even Flannery your Mew player out of the game. Even though you have that Skyscraper ability, Mew can of course still hit through you with Max Miracle for those 130s plus the tablet damage. So actually just running out the Mew player of resources is actually Duraludon's plan in that matchup. And then you have your tanky, Cave Zamazenta plays for a few other matchups here and there as well. And that Skyscraper still is annoying for Jolteon. It's annoying for Urshifu, at least the Rapid Strike. The single strike deck you can still challenge as well because you're going to continually hammer and fan at the same time. So hopefully they're like damaging themselves and pushing them into range for you to actually deal good numbers into them. And you are playing those big charms as well to force like Scrapper or Tool Jammer to actually make the single strike player draw like incredibly well. And actually, I think in recent times people have been dropping the tool removal from single strike anyway because it's only really good in like some very niche scenarios. So yeah, it's benefiting from exactly the position we're in the metagame. Jolteon is like just popular enough that Suicune isn't more than like 10% of the meta either. I think earlier on in this meta, there was like too much Suicune Ludicolo for Duraludon to be like a realistic deck in the game. But I think Suicune's down to like that 7% margin where Duraludon can dodge and weave and be a pain for a ton of decks. So I think it's like relevant at this point. It wouldn't take much to be irrelevant again, I would say. I think going back up to like a 7th energy in Mew, swapping your stadium count to play a second copy of Training Court as well can even be enough to push that matchup back into unfavorable. So I think there's easy adaptations. It's just whether people can respect Duraludon enough or like be bothered really to make these lines happen. So it will be interesting to see how Duraludon carries on because the deck itself is super wacky with a ton of supporters you don't typically see, like even the Averys trying to remove bench from the opponent and out-resource some archetypes in that regard. You're hurting the draw engine of Genesect, you're hurting Suicune's damage output to an extent, hurting the go-wide approach of some Intel engines, and even like Single Strike as well, you're limiting their Houndooms. So yeah, you have a ton of disruption packed into one deck, and you're just hoping that can slowly get you over the line.
Yeah. I'll take on the other Dragon deck, Ray. We're still putting in tier 3. We still think it's really not that good, but it has seen a bit of a flash in the pan success recently. Obviously, even back in the Evolving Skies meta, we kind of a lot of people. The opinions on this deck was kind of all over the place, but we often said it's kind of if it draws pretty well, it can realistically just kind of motor through anything. but there's going to be enough decks kind of keeping it honest to the point where there's enough pressure on your flaffies and stuff like that, and all of these awkward things that kind of made Ray a bit awkward. Like I say, it's seen some flash in the pan success recently. I'm pretty sure from what I've seen, there's been a lot of it's kind of testament to Battle VIP Pass more than anything.
Yeah.
And I think some lists have been playing like Adventurous Discovery as well, but in general, it feels like it's just been people trying out, really pushing the boundaries on that Battle VIP Pass engine that's become staple in a couple of top tier archetypes, which is interesting and is still a very divisive card, but I think has really proved itself over the past few weeks. But like, this just isn't the best place to use it. We've seen like Single Strike adopt this Battle VIP Pass engine now. That's just way better. It's another Oko deck that's way more consistent, has better typing, and it just feels like a much better deck. So yeah, Ray, whilst being a bit flashier and a bit cooler, I think is basically just like a dumbed down Single Strike, and there's not too much reason to play it. But we wanted to talk about it just because it has had a decent number of top 8s over the past few weeks, just kind of out of the blue compared to some of the more consistent archetypes that have been doing well.
Yeah, I think it's weird. I don't see a selling point for Ray, so I guess it is literally people just wanting to put the task on something different, I guess. So it's creative, but I don't think there's much actual reason behind it. So Dragapult's interesting. It was one of these things where it went away, then came back in Evolving Skies, and now it's kind of like dead again. It sort of dips in and out of the format whenever necessary, and I think now it's getting pushed out that little bit further where the ping damage is slightly less good because there's slightly less Intel engines just naturally around. And I also think that with VIP Pass, people go wider and they still get their second Hound Hour into play, so you can't really disrupt any of those dark decks as easily, whereas sometimes you are preying on the bad hands and like hitting them with the money, knocking out their one Hound Hour sort of thing, and just trying to tempo out that way. And there's just simply more dark in the game as well. People are targeting Mew, which punishes Dragapult. People are squeezing in hammers into like their Suicunes and fans and whatnot into all sorts of decks, even as a one-off, just because of Inteleon engine. And Dragapult hates all this stuff, so really caught in the crossfire targeting Mew also really hurts the Dragapult, and it feels like there's just much better snipers in the game right now, so we're dropping it down to tier 3.
Yeah. I'll take on Suicune Inteleon. This is kind of the more straight Suicune build that kind of looks to not really have any other particular attackers per se. There's cross switches are kind of in and out, but the more popular build we've seen lately is kind of a hammer focused build where we've kind of always said that one of Mew's weaknesses is energy disruption and stuff, and it's trying to pair Suicune's tempo and the additional damage from Inteleons and kind of the consistency from the Drizziles, with also trying to lean in on Mew and a couple of other archetypes, heavy reliance on not many energy in their deck. And you're kind of able to approach Mew, again, for example, from two different angles. You're applying a decent amount of pressure and through sort of tempo means by not attaching too much to a Suicune. It's only a 2-prizer, so you're not halfway towards losing the game after a KO. Yes, it's fairly easy for them to KO you. They don't need tablets or anything like that, but you're able to trade into them quite efficiently, but you're also able to hammer and fan your way to forcing them to find more pieces, which can be awkward. And after a couple of turns here and there with your hammers and fans going in favorably for you and being able to get rid of fusion energy, you can start to sprinkle some damage around here and there as well to get to the point where maybe we're even able to KO that second Mew just throughout the game and into then a one-shot from Suicune. So yeah, we've kind of seen this build be a bit more popular than the cross-switcher build, but I still think the cross-switcher build is pretty interesting. I think the concept of cross-switchers with Inteleon is still something that's not largely unexplored, but I still think there's a lot of merit to it, because being able to do like a Marnie plus cross-switcher play or anything like that is still incredibly powerful. Gust plus Marnie is still crazy in my eyes. So yeah, the tempo of Suicune with the kind of flexibility of not running a secondary attacker, being able to find space for some of these more disruptive item cards, has proved itself. I don't think it's as good as some of the Suicune builds that look to just Oko, particularly like the Ludicolo build, which I still think is pretty solid right now because it's, again, that kind of tempo game plan. But this is approaching in a different angle. This is trying to be a bit more defensive. And yeah, it's kind of proved itself. Like I say, it's not, I don't think, the most popular or the best of the Suicune builds, but I think it's definitely up there in tier 1.5.
Yeah, let's just get the others out the way while we're talking Suicune. So I think we both agree that Ludicolo is probably still just like the safest route. I think it just really punishes single strike more than most archetypes. I think it's probably one of the best matchups that you can face. And I think it can reach on Mew, especially because people do seem to be super keen on just like VIP pass vomiting out cards that they just like fall into the trap very often. And sometimes that's them just sort of wanting to draw too many cards and get going, but sometimes that's just where their hand leads them and they like haven't hit their turn attachment yet, and so they have to put another Genesect into play, and that helps you reach that little bit more. And I still think you're probably teching Fan, like maybe up to 2 even, if you can find the space. You can play those capes. I think that's another alternative as well. If you play like 3 toughness cape, maybe you then can see a Mew sometimes missing. You know, sometimes their Cram does flip tails, and then you can find that wiggle room in that matchup. But in general, you're just super consistent deck with like a ton of engine. And then again, still talking about the water stuff, I think the Ice Rider's the deck that I've been most impressed with Cross Switcher. I think it makes the most sense there because you're naturally discarding your resources with the Ice Rider, so you want to Melanie and Cross Switcher like very often. But we think it's still worse than just the straight Suicune stuff for the most part, because its damage mod getting blocked by that Mew is just so detrimental to you, and it's a bit more difficult to like chain your attackers, a bit more work to get set up, which means it's just even more punished into the spread decks really. When your engine doesn't quite come online. Whereas Suicune has that little bit more leeway. It has like Capture Energy, for example, to just get more basics in the openings. So slightly less consistent than the other Suicunes.
Yeah. What to go for next? I think just off the back of from what I saw a result in this past 24 hours, Moltres Rapid Strike is a deck that kind of looks to be one of these hit for weakness kind of decks. We've seen this pairing kind of all over the place ever since rotation was announced. A lot of people really touted this to be one of the most popular archetypes. And again, going into Fusion Strike, a lot of people thought Urshifu was all of a sudden kind of back on the menu. A lot of people were playing it, albeit with a Melanie engine. But a lot of people thought, okay, let's go back to the Moltres build and hit that weakness on Mew with the Moltreses. Kind of didn't do anything for a few weeks, but I have seen some results over the past couple of weeks that looks to be maybe getting it back in, or pushing the deck back into maybe up the tiers a little bit. It still feels to me like it's one of these Urshifu builds, like it always has, that it's just trying to do a bit too much. You need too many pieces to try and make everything go perfectly. But even as soon as Mew came out, we saw that Moltres was a very, very good counter for Mew. It's fairly efficient. It kind of is self-sufficient as well. And with right hands, it really is impressive how you can just burst a Moltres out of nowhere and oppose a Mew, which is crazy, especially given that you only have a 2-prizer. Unfortunately, I think the deck's natural inconsistencies compared to like the Melanie build of Rapid Strike are what for me causes problems, because you don't have as much flexibility and you're not able to be as consistent as the other Rapid Strike builds. But like Moltres as a card, and not just the V Moltres, to be fair, both Moltres we have, but Moltres has proved itself to be a really, really strong counter to Mew, and that's really been apparent over the past couple of weeks as well. So yeah, I get the combination, and I think on the day, if the cards are looking good for you, it's a winning deck. Obviously, Rapid Strike is still a incredibly strong. Rapid Strike Urshi is still an incredibly strong card. But for me personally, it kind of rests at tier 2 just because it seems a lot less consistent than naturally a lot of these other decks, especially the other Rapid Strike build that is kind of less oppressive into Mew. It really doesn't like Mew anywhere near as much. But it feels like the rest of the field you have so much more flexibility with.
Yeah, I think that's why it lands in that tier 1. And I would probably put it as like our best tier 1 deck, the Melanie Fu. It feels like it beats like literally everything that isn't Mew, in my opinion. Like it's bad against Duraludon as well, sure. But of the other like top 10 decks, I guess, I think it's very, very strong into most of them. It does still feel like a very difficult deck to play against for so many archetypes. And maybe this is my bias here, but watching so many of Todd's streams where he just plays this deck non-stop, it makes me want to play it a lot. And I test this like as much as Mew. I think those are the two decks that I play the most right now. It's a super interesting and rewarding deck to play, and he's tried to make that Mew matchup as close as he can. I would still call it negative, but I wouldn't say it's worse than like a 45-55. Unless you're the player going second, and then it's really hard. But yeah, I like where the list has gone, where you're like double telescopic and also Medicham coming back into the list, so you can finish off that Genesect and just try and breathe for a turn, because you're always hyperventilating in that matchup to draw as good as possible. So yeah, I love this archetype. I think it's really sweet, and it does just clown on everything that isn't Mew, I say.
Yeah. Rounding out tier 1, I think we're going to finish things off with the sort of old, more standard build of Single Strike, not the Gengar build necessarily, but yeah, it's kind of adopted, like I mentioned when talking about the Ray. It's kind of adopted this Battle VIP Pass engine, again, really pushing the boundaries on how good VIP Pass is and proving that VIP Pass is a pretty good card, to be honest. It's always kind of been touted as one of the best ways to counter Mew, and I think it's kind of, even though there are awkwardnesses in the matchup here and there, I think it's kind of proved itself that it is that archetype, which is good. And again, it's another archetype that still keeps people honest. Single Strike Urshi, and the combination of just being able to gust and Marnie and gust and other supporters, like I mentioned with the cross switches, is still very, very punishing to a lot of these other non-Mew decks, because you're able to sometimes take out their only attacker or take out what they're building up on the bench and kind of present yourself as the 2 prize option or the 3 prize option if they have gone into their sort of their 3 prizes, their VMAXs as well. So nothing's really changed with this archetype. Obviously, there are more intricacies, I would say, than there were in the last format, but still very, very solid. And just, again, being that 2 types is also pretty nice, because you can see the dark type is great for Mew, but there's also still a couple of dark weak decks here and there. And even though like Mew has kind of taken the place of a couple of these other awkward matchups, I still think it's a fairly solid pick for a lot of these tournaments, just because nothing has really changed outside of Mew. Nothing has really changed too much in the format. You're still the same deck that you can have kind of been playing, or you're still running the same game plan that you've been playing for 3 or 4 months now, and nothing is like nothing. There's nothing changed about that. I think, like we mentioned when talking about Ludicolo, that's the only other matchup you really want to dodge and weave if you can. But especially the further you get down the tier list as well, I feel like you find more and more solid matchups. It's a really good sort of cleanup deck that just kind of picks off anyone that's trying to be cute or anything like that. Single Strike is really good at just keeping people honest and saying I can take 6 prizes really, really quickly with a lot of tempo. Can you do it any quicker? And a lot of decks really can't at the moment.
Yeah, sticking with the single train, let's talk about Gengar. I actually do quite like Gengar, and we're putting him in tier 1.5. I think there's just that little bit too much Urshi, like you said. It sort of lost the battle of Single Strike. It's almost cannibalizing each other, right? So the better Gengar gets, the worse it gets in the meta, because people just switch to the Urshi. So just having that and a really bad Rapid Strike matchup is hindering it from pushing into that tier 1. But it's very good into Jolteon, very good into Mew, and it's like still 50-50 into Suicune, because you just stay as a 2-prizer, and you're able to like just trade on each other pretty reasonably, I think. And it's good into a lot of these other like lower tier decks as well, because it is just tempo and a lot of damage output coming in there as well that you can just chain quite easily. So it doesn't quite have all the benefits of that Urshifu typing. That's what's keeping it at bay, but the card is still very powerful, and it still boasts one of the best Mew matchups out there. So yeah, still powerful and valid for sure. And again, it's one of those pick your moment type decks to play that Gengar. There's going to be these inflection points where there's that little bit more Mew than there is like the single strike Urshifu build, and then the pendulum can swing again. So pick your moments, but it can really shine and break through into tournaments and go deep.
Yeah. Let's pick up, I guess, the 3 single prize archetypes. There's Malamar, there's the Moltres archetype, and there's the Obstagoon archetype. First things first, Malamar, I think, is still kind of in that tier 2 range, probably lower towards the lower end of tier 2, but still is able to keep decks honest. It doesn't quite feel as Baby Blounds-esque, but it's kind of got that Baby Blounds feel, right, where it's just a single prize that does a boatload of damage and tries to uptrade in as many situations as possible. Meloetta has made things, I think, a little bit more awkward here and there because they can kind of compete a little bit. But the way Malamar is built, it can obviously it's able to uptrade in a lot of situations. The fact that there's so many kind of awkward, well, not awkward matchups, but still there's so many Inteleon decks and stuff like that is what for me sometimes holds it back. Especially because you're so reliant on being able to chain these Inks, and a lot of the time because you're having to dig for so many pieces to reach into some of the VMAX knockouts and hit here and there, you're forced to kind of go into a position where you have only an Inkay and a Malamar down, and you're just kind of crossing your fingers and praying. So for me, I still think it's a bit of a scary archetype to play, but it's a fairly consistent hitter into like top 32s here and there. So people, it's pulling in records here and there. It's had a couple of top 8s as well. It's just kind of one of these archetypes that on a good day, on a good run, it can definitely do well. It definitely uptrades in the right situations. And to be honest, it does sometimes feel like that baby Blounds where even though you're a stage 1, if you're going second against or whatever, they can somehow like just turn up with 320 on turn 2 against you, and you're kind of like, well, I don't know. There's not much I can do from this position. I have to like look for my right hand to develop an attacker or whatever, and that's like turn 2 of the game. So there will be games that Malamar definitely steals. It still feels a bit scary for me, but I think it's probably maybe joint favorite for one prize archetypes. Yeah. Joe has recently convinced me on the Moltres archetype as well, so I'll let him go ahead with that. But yeah, it's kind of joint tier 2 for me with the Moltres archetype.
Yeah, the Malamar's super annoying. Like, not playing any Gust or even just playing one boss is like really annoying at times because you end up just passing or doing poke damage. I know there's that Tech Persimmon that can sometimes go in and just to like fling to finish off things that you've hit if you're just that little bit off, but it doesn't feel great. But I'm actually trying VIP Pass in Mali. I think that's a ton of fun. So you can just go wide or like really wide turn 1 to actually have the like 3 Cincino plus Octillery like turn 2, and then you are popping off, which is great. So let's talk about the Cawthorn deck, the Malevolent Charge, Galarian Moltres with Hoopa as like an early game attacker and your Intel engine. It has a really interesting game plan because it plays very differently to most archetypes where tempo, you just kind of like give it to your opponent the whole time. You're just trying to chip away, do as much sort of damage as you can while your opponent just sort of pounds into you, and then it's like you've sprung the trap card, right? Because suddenly Malevolent Charge is hitting enough damage like after a Hooper attack to finish off like a 3-prize Pokemon, and then they knock out that Moltres, you can like Clara and get it back, and then it's doing like enough with Intel pings to just win the game in 2 hits. So you really are twiddling your thumbs. You're trying to get free hits here and there, like maybe you take out a 1-prize Pokemon and pepper up a 2 or 3 prizer, and you're kind of like happy with that. So yeah, very interesting how it's a super important to set up deck. I find myself using like Keep Calling very often early on, just like pivoting between my stupid like Tapu Koko or whatever to give myself free retreat, and then you just go back in with Hooper, but you don't actually care that much about attacking. You're just trying to build up your Intel army, and if you're playing against this deck, definitely target down every Drizzle and Inteleon you see, because they don't care about Hoopers getting knocked out or whatever else. And yeah, I think it's a delicate tightrope kind of deck because it's not like super consistent, but what it like its late game strategy is very difficult for some archetypes to beat, especially if they don't play the spread. And like most 1-prize decks, the spread is going to be like very bad for it, and that's what's keeping even the best 1-prize decks down in this tier 2 category, I would say. Yeah.
The other 1-prize archetype is the Obstagoon archetype. That's kind of the very, very big archetype for the first couple of weeks. I think for me personally, the archetype hasn't had the legs going deeper into the format. I think it was like a legitimate surprise as to how well it did in the early weeks, and it seemed to be, in the early couple of weeks where people necessarily hadn't established strong lists or didn't know how to play around it, that kind of thing. I think it was a legitimate archetype, but I think that kind of flash in the pan success has gone now. I think people are way more aware of the archetype. I think we found a stronger 1-prize dark archetype, which I think was another very, very good boasting point for Obstagoon. I think we've found something to take its place in the Moltres deck, because obviously it's a one prizer that's only a basic rather than a stage 2. Now there's obviously like benefits to the stage 2 that Obstagoon has, but I think it's been outclassed in most scenarios. I think it's better than some of these these tier 3 archetypes, just because some of its attacks can legitimately be very annoying. But I think for me personally, the Cawthorn deck does a lot of what Obstagoon wanted to do, but way more consistently because you're a basic rather than a stage 2. So that's the biggest selling or the biggest drawback for me for Obstagoon. We've taken that concept and we've bundled it into a basic deck and kind of been able to gain a bit more space and here and there make trims because we don't have to run a stage 2 or anything like that. So yeah, I think it did exceedingly well in the first couple of weeks, but I think now there's less of a reason to play it because we kind of have the same archetype but more flexible and with more space.
And Goon was a way smarter deck at the beginning of this format because people were still playing Pult, and as soon as Pult fell off that cliff, this deck also sort of took that bath because, I mean, it was trying to target Mew and Drago, which were both dark, weak, popular archetypes, and then this fell off the cliff, so then there's a lot less reason to play Big Goon Man over there. So let's just shove Zacian Zam in 1.5. It's like the permanent 1.5 deck where, it's just doing its thing, man. It's just annoying. It's pretty good into like these. Well, it's decent into some of these Suicunes. It's decent into single strike. You force a lot out of them. It's like okay against Mew. It never feels great against Mew, but it like sometimes can just get that job done. And I do think Crushing Hammers coming back into that list is reasonable. I've even seen like Avery come into this deck, and I don't think it's that bad just to be annoying resource wise for some of these decks, and just to give you that extra breathing and wiggle room. So you can play it just as it always has been with the phones and the guru and whatnot and your capes, because there's legitimately a lot less tool scrapper again, right? And that really helps this deck because that's like the biggest selling point of this archetype, that you're 280, 270 hit point boyos, and that's just really annoying to deal with. So the fact that there's less tool removal is giving the window back to this deck to actually stick around and have enough turns to get its job done. So yeah, annoying to deal with still.
I still think it's a great entry level deck as well. It's kind of it's never going to be absolutely groundbreaking, especially as it was at the start of the evolve or the post rotation meta. But it like having such a cheap entry level tier 1.5 deck is still a great thing, a great feeling for the game. So yeah, if you're looking to get into the game or you're looking to introduce your friends to the game, I still think it's probably the best deck on this tier list to do it for cheap and to have a moderately successful deck. So yeah, really, there are still definitely some great selling points for it. Let's fill out this 2.5 tier a little bit. We've got, even though it did really, it exceeded itself the other day. We have Shadow Rider Calyrex. We still think it's still down in that 2.5 tier. It's like there's just no reason to play it, right? We have you don't need it for the typing because we have a great psychic deck. You don't need it for the Oko potential because we have a great deck that can, well, we have multiple decks that can push into Okos. You don't need it for the draw power because we have a deck that has a better draw engine, and all three of those things are the same deck. They're Mew, so it's like, why would you? Realistically, why would you? It feels like why would you ever want to play this deck compared to Mew? Because it feels like Mew does everything but on steroids. Now there are selling points, there are reasons that people maybe stick to Shadow Rider, but I really don't think there's much reason to play it right now. Obviously, some of the two prize archetypes, I feel like you can get into, be able to apply a bit more pressure to them, and also I feel like things like Jolteon and stuff can be still okay. Obviously, they sometimes play heavy path and stuff, but I feel like you're going to be able to get to the point where they're not applying enough pressure before you're able to reach into the sort of that 300 range. So there are reasons to play it, and obviously there's still a couple of psychic weak decks around, but one of them is still one of them is still single strike that's just gonna spawn an Umbreon and just do the exact same thing as it did to Dragapult back in the day. So it feels like it's outclassed on almost every level by Mew, but like I don't know, I feel like it's just a fan favorite, well, not a fan favorite, but there's a lot of backing towards the deck, and it has like crept into a couple of top 8s and top 4s here for me personally, there's no reason to play this archetype over Mew, but I'd play this over something like Ray or Dragapult just because you actually have a win condition in the game, right? Dragapult just does nowhere near enough damage anymore, and Ray feels like you're batting against yourself half the time, whereas Shadow Rider does have that inevitability to it. So there is a win condition within the deck. It's just it feels like Mew achieves that so much more consistently and so much quicker that there's not too much reason to play it right now.
Yeah, agreed. I never thought this card would get power crept so quickly, by the way. Like, what an
It's
insane...
crazy.
All the stats on this card tell me insane, and it's just not getting the job done. Crazy, to be honest. Let's take on Victini Hammers as this sort of like quad-style deck. I think this almost compares to Duraludon, because it's like a slightly easier to get rolling Duraludon, but it doesn't have that amazing ability to fall back on. So you're really leading into heads flips of hammers and your fans and whatnot. And yes, you have that turn 2 tempo as well that can sort of keep you relevant in matchups where Duraludon just like is sort of passing into them and hoping the ability gets them there, whereas the Victini is just sort of like trying to poke as well as disrupt. So you're just trying to buy turns rather than like stall out the entire game. So it's like a tempo Duraludon, and I think relying on coin flips never feels that great. Relying on like Kabu as your engine as well is kind of wacky. Your typing is just terrible as well, into that Suicune, which is just a hard L to be taking right now. And I also think Mew can like sort of go over the top. If there are still Mews out there that are playing that Latias as well, it can be a big problem for them. So yeah, sort of 2.5. You can steal wins on your disruption trainers, and sometimes it goes well for you, but it's not a super consistent approach.
Yeah. Rapid Strike Inteleon, we're actually going to drop all the way down to tier 3, which sucks because I think this was a really, really interesting archetype. In a world where it felt like the format was completely solved, this was a very new archetype to try and play around with. But it turns out there's a boatload of one-shot decks. There's still a lot of outside of the one-shot decks, there's things like Jolteon and stuff which apply way too much pressure. There's even weird things like Duraludon which have appeared out of nowhere that no one predicted that completely auto wins you. Like it's just been this whirlwind of awkward stuff that's happened for Inteleon that's just meant it's really just not been that good, which is a shame because I think it's so creative and it could have led to a really, really interesting kind of power struggle between trying to out resource people and waste their damage and then out Cheryl people, essentially out heal people, waste all of their resources, especially in a format where so many people are kind of like it's just so draw focused. It would have been really interesting to see an archetype that tried to live through everyone's insane draw engines and just be at the end of it saying, yeah, you've done everything you can. Now I'm just going to hit 140 every turn and win the game because I've managed to weather the storm. But unfortunately, there was just too much of a storm for it to weather. There's too many one-shot decks. There's too many decks that can apply pressure that aren't one-shot decks. And there's even auto losses that have just kind of cropped up out of nowhere that no one predicted that just you have to fold to. So yeah, really unfortunate because I think it's such a creative card and it would have been really interesting to see how it had developed had we maybe had the damage maybe been toned down a little bit here and there in some archetypes, but unfortunately because it hasn't, it's just kind of folded, which is pretty sad to say, I think.
Yeah. We'll go on to Leafeon. We're going to keep it just about clinging on to 1.5, and we, coming into this format, were skeptical of Leafeon. We thought that, the dark days of Gengar were coming with all those hiding darks, just removing all those retreat costs, making life difficult for Leafeon, as well as the natural free retreat of Mew being a bad matchup, was going to spell doom for Leafeon. But it's just about clung in there, being reasonable against some of these Suicune matchups, being a bit of a headache, and also, has the big boast of having a very good single strike matchup now that they are still playing Urshifu and Umbreon. So the fact that the Urshi sort of traditional build won meant that Leafeon was still relevant, and it still got some good traits for it. You can still defend against Hammer and Fan relatively nicely with your ability. You still can out heal things like Jolteon with your natural Max Leaf and your that you can tech in Cook even now if you want to for a better damage break point. So yeah, it's still okay. I don't feel like it has anywhere near enough merit to play in the format right now, but it's still got some fan base and it's still getting some results. So yeah, it's just kind of clinging on. I don't think it'll ever go higher up than 1.5. but yeah, it's still relevant, I guess, in some metas.
Yeah. The final deck I'll talk about is probably going to be Sylveon. Sylveon was a really interesting one in the first couple of weeks of the format because it kind of has always been this box style deck where you're just trying to hit the right weaknesses and that kind of thing. And it wasn't too much of a change of the initial 60 to be able to account for Mew because you had to go back to the Moltres build, but that had been done before, so people like knew what they were doing with it. And you had to fit in a 1/1 Blaziken, but again, that had been done before, so you just had to make some kind of chops and changes there, and it was able to deal with a lot of different archetypes as it always has been. I think since the format started to settle down and solve itself a little bit more, there's been less reason to play it because there's these decks are we've kind of developed this metagame where these decks are naturally kind of competing with each other to the point where this box style doesn't really work, and because of that, also because of Mew's natural presence in the format, you really have to lean into some of the more awkward techs like Moltres and Blaziken, which are nowhere near as flexible in some of these other matchups. Whereas when you could build a list which was able to focus a bit more on Urshi and stuff, Urshi was such a good tempo card. It was able to be a lot more flexible in a lot of other matchups, like regardless. So I think naturally Mew's progression kind of forced Sylveon into this weird spot where they have to play awkward, more awkward attackers. And like, why would you be playing things like Moltres in a Sylveon build where you can just play the Rapid Strike build instead? Blaziken is kind of pointless. There was a couple of times playing against this deck where it felt like it really had Mew kind of in its hands. It was able to do a lot against Mew, but I think the more the matchup was played out, it was more the Mew missing turns rather than the Sylveon being built to apply pressure in the right way. Because it's naturally, again, as it always has been, going to be one of these kind of awkward. Hopefully you draw the right pieces for the right matchup, and if you don't, you're kind of a subpar two-shotting deck that's not even anything like it doesn't boast anything special like a Suicune or anything. You're just kind of settling at that 170 and kind of hoping they brick or whatever. So it's kind of developed, it's pushed its way down into like tier 2.5. But I think, at least for me, at the start of the format, it looked to be quite interesting. It looked to be kind of an unsung counter to Mew because of the way people had built it. I remember in the first couple of weeks there was 2 or 3 top fours just from Sylveon, basically playing like heavy Moltres, heavy Blaziken, but it's kind of just gone nowhere from that, and more decks have kind of taken its place, and there's no real reason to try and build a box to try and hit everything when the majority of the time you just need to be hitting Mew for weakness rather than trying to cram everything in to try and hit all of the different decks in tier 1. There's just not the meta representation right now for this box style, I don't think.
Yeah, I think Sylveon doesn't like the energy disruption either, and like you said, you can't really support a Raihan engine in this deck very easily. Like, you can play Eldegoss maybe, and like 2 Raihan at most, but you don't really support the Moltres V that well. You're, like you said, just hoping that you have that free turn to charge and pass into them or like hit into them, and they just don't gust you miraculously. But as we've seen, Mew's got more aggressive and more ruthless at just popping them straight away, and then Sylveon's again back to twiddling its thumbs. So yeah. And the last deck we'll talk about is Eternatus, that does quite the opposite against Mew. It is very good into Mew, one of the strongest on the slide here, actually. I think maybe it's only the Cawthorn deck that has a better time into Mew. But Eternatus is just putting the pressure on. There's a lot less path in the metagame as well. I think it's pretty much just Jolteon right now. So you actually get to draw off of Crobat quite a lot. It brings its own challenges because Jolteon can ping you down, and there's obviously Urshifu decks out there. So you're terrified of running into single or rapid strike, but you're okay. Well, also even Suicune is a bad matchup, but at least you can bop Mew. Like, that's it. Just cross your fingers that you face more Mew than anything else in the tournament, and you can go positive. And you have a good draw engine. You can actually play Umbreon yourself if you really want to, and Tower if you want to go down that whole avenue. And you are just fast tempo, you can just be swinging as a VMAX turn 2 and hitting a lot, and sometimes that just knocks out their guy. And yeah, that's really what's going to keep you relevant and in the game. Still low tier, of course, but you are at least punishing the best deck in format right now.
So yeah, that's kind of our December tier list. We're going to leave the link to this down below, so make sure you share it with us on Facebook, Twitter, Discord, any of the relevant places if you want to share your thoughts. Obviously, there'll be decks that maybe we haven't covered or there will be discrepancies between your list and our list. So feel free to leave that down in the comments as well, where you think maybe we undersold or oversold decks here and there. And yeah, this is kind of how we've seen the meta develop. We didn't do too bad, I guess, in the first instance, but there's definitely been some interesting changes throughout the format.
Yeah, I was just going to ask one question before we go. What's the deck that you would just play in big scale events right now, and what deck would you say like around that 2 and lower category do you think there's the best chance of like climbing that tier list?
So yeah, for me it would be Mew 100%.
Yep.
It's just there's just no like for me there's almost no reason to not play it, even with such a massive target on its back. It still feels like it brushes that off so easily. So I think I'd just be playing Mew. Should there be a regional tomorrow? Though if I were playing a regional and had to play a tier 2 or lower deck, I actually think I would probably look into the Moltres deck like you have discussed. You've especially over the past like 24 hours. We've been chatting about it a lot, and it sounds really, really interesting. And I also think it'd be quite refreshing just playing a one prize archetype because that hasn't really happened for the past like 12 months or whatever necessarily super competitively. So the one to me that looks like it has the best, or I would want to be targeting Mew if I wasn't playing
Sure.
Mew, and I think the one that does that the best is probably the Moltres archetype. So yeah, I think I would look to play that. And I could fully see this if we did this again in a month's time, because it feels like this Moltres deck has kind of really been in the latter week, maybe 2 weeks. It started to pop up a bit more and had more representation. I could see it pushing its way easily into 1.5. Maybe not all the way to 1, but easily into like the upper echelons of 1.5. Should we do this again in a month's time or whatever? So I think that's the deck right now that doesn't have the representation to be up in the top tiers, but definitely has the potential. Should we see more people playing it, which I expect we will, because the more success it has, that's what people do. They pick up decks, they try them out, and naturally they lead to more successes.
Yeah, nice. I think I'd go with single strike as like the deck I would play in a tournament right now. It would be Urshi probably. I am just enjoying VIP Pass like way too much in that deck. I think it's just good, and I don't want to deal with facing like a bunch of mirrors. That's just what puts me off Mew because I feel like it's just out of my control too much, which is like my only black mark against Mew right now. I don't even care about all these dark counter decks. I mostly just am annoyed about mirror and having to face that.
Yeah.
And for my like tier 2 climber, I still feel like Ice Rider is like so underrepresented in this meta. I think it's very good into single strike. It's less dicey into Jolteon than the other Suicune decks. And I think it's got a manageable Mew if you are committing tech spaces towards that. And I still think cross switches are like so fun and good in the deck that it's just like such an unexplored territory that it baffles me. I think it's just a crazy combo for that archetype. So I'd still like to see more Ice Rider representation.
Yeah. So yeah, again, that's another question for you guys. What would you be playing right now? But yeah, leave it all down below. We're always very interested to hear it. And yeah, other than that, thank you very much for watching. I've been Jack with Joe from Omnipoke, and we look forward to seeing you guys in another video soon. Cheers, everyone.